gondola basket. All he needed now were the refilled propane tanks put securely in the gondola basket, since the burners were already attached to the gondola. His assistants are not due to return until 3:30 p.m. with the tanks, so the professor decides to re-examine the globe in the luxury of his car. The best times to fly a hot air balloon are early morning or late afternoon to dusk. Professor Watson needs help to fill the balloon with hot air from the burners, all while holding the top of the balloon steady. It all sounds tricky, but really, in the calm air, it is quite straightforward, as long as you know the sequence. The morning sun has burnt off the ground mist. The day looks promising for a balloon flight, with the temperature rising above 68 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind no more than 7 miles per hour. It's an ideal time to fly a hot air balloon. While he waits for his ground helpers to arrive, the professor unpacks a small box. Inside the box is the small ornate globe that he had shown Alex earlier. As the professor looks at the globe, his mind drifts back to his younger days. In his youthful student days, when he spent time studying at the University of Florida, Professor Watson had become friends with Edward Leedskalnin, a Latvian who had immigrated to America. Leedskalnin had reportedly understood the laws of weight and leverage well. Edward lived in a stone castle, now called Coral Castle, in Florida, which he had apparently constructed himself from beautifully carved rocks, weighing many tons each. One day, he decided to move the whole castle some 10 miles, all on his own, at night. Professor Watson felt that Edward Leedskalnin had indeed discovered an ancient science that defies the traditional laws of gravity. When moving large pieces of stone around the castle, Leedskalnin utilized a standard block and tackle attached to a tripod, with the addition of a small box sitting atop of the tripod. It was believed to be some ancient magnetic device, although the exact purpose of this box was never revealed to him. Professor Watson started to explore this phenomenon. In doing so, he gained much insight into its origins, the effect of magnetic fields, light waves, and even sound waves. Looking at the globe in his hand again, the professor remembered the day he and this mysterious globe became acquainted. It was on one of his balloon flights. He had landed in a field where he sensed something unusual was present. After a few minutes of walking around the landed balloon, he saw the small metallic-like globe glowing in the grass. When he picked up this object, he felt a strange sensation, similar to having known all about this globe for many years. He had a sense that the globe was going to help him in his work. When he handled the globe, it would hum or vibrate. It seemed as if it had a mind of its own. Sometimes the professor felt he knew what it would do, but at other times, he really had no idea. Interestingly, it did seem to put good ideas into his head when he needed them most. Ever since the day he found it, the globe had accompanied him on all his adventures, as it was small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. Not wanting to damage the globe or its ornate engravings, he had made a wooden box and a special pouch to protect it. The box was designed to store the globe when it was not being used. The globe seemed to the professor to have a power source all of its own, but there appeared no way to open it. Sometimes it would just change colors. Sometimes a small beam of light appeared, rather like a flashlight or torch, and the color of this light often changed. When Professor Watson picked up the globe and then thought about something, it was as if the answer popped into his head. He had become used to picking up this strange globe whenever he needed an answer to a problem he was working on. Most often, The globe would help him focus on the task at hand, giving him good ideas to try. Today, he wanted to test the globe on how to direct his hot air balloon to a specific destination. The direction of hot air balloons is usually controlled by the wind's direction, which is always varying at different heights. Today's flight was to be a test flight utilizing his findings up to now. By the time the professor had checked and double-checked all the equipment, a very wise course of action when flying, it was almost 12 p.m. His assistants were due around 3:30 p.m., a good time in the autumn to commence a flight. Professor Watson went back to his car to find the lunch he had packed earlier. It included a flask of coffee, a few biscuits, a ham and tomato sandwich, a banana, and a bottle of water. He sat in his old Volvo estate car, slowly eating the banana, then pouring a cup of coffee from the flask he had made earlier, listening to the current weather forecast. It sounded good for the proposed flight, with winds of no more than 5 miles per hour up to 200 feet, increasing to 7 miles per hour above this to almost 1,000 feet, and then increasing to 10 miles per hour up to 2,000 feet. He took out his smartphone, marveling at the power in the palm of his hand. It wasn't that long ago that he would have had to have used a pencil, paper, slide rule, log tables, a detailed map, dividers and a compass, followed by a sextant. Today, a simple app like Motion Global Positioning System, GPS, on his phone could do all the work. In seconds, it fixed his position, plotted his track, and then sent the information back to his desktop computer in real time. He wondered how long it would be before he could perfect his latest use of the globe, allowing him to just think where he wanted to go and to be transported there. Pulling out the globe, he imagined he was back in the 18th century. Vivid images appeared then. He thought he could hear people talking in the background and they felt close to him. However, the physical time change was what eluded him. Suddenly, he had an idea. What if he really thought hard about the people who may have solved similar problems already? Famous inventors from the past. Professor Watson allowed his mind to wander. Of all the people he knew or had read about, only 2 people stood out as perhaps able to solve this problem. The first was Merlin, who had the professor thinking about the magic spells for King Arthur, of Tintagel Castle and Glastonbury. He even thought about the Druids and Stonehenge, marveling at the skills of the creators of such magical places. The second was Nikola Tesla. He looked at his wireless phone and then the car radio. It was Tesla, with his electrical inventions of the 1800s, who had been involved in both. This fact remained in his thoughts. In particular, he thought of Tesla's teleautomaton, to think that Tesla had demonstrated a form of wireless remote control before 1900. Holding the globe and taking another sip of coffee, the professor thought more about Tesla and his inventions. He thought about radio waves, then magnetic waves, and then light waves. What if he could use the light waves to travel between places by hopping on one wave, then jumping to another until he reached his destination? Professor Watson recalled James Maxwell's theory, then Einstein's, and finally Feynman on how electromagnetism, light, and matter all interact. That some source, be it electric or magnetic in nature, creates a changing electric or magnetic field. We have seen that either one is then able to create the other, so we need only create one. As the changing fields move in space, at each point, the fields create each other. They keep changing and hence keep creating themselves. The professor muttered aloud. Completely exhausted by all this thinking, he at last finished the last sip of coffee. Normally, it would be time to take a short nap, but he doubted if his staff would allow him that luxury today. Then out of the blue, he had one of those moments. You know, the ones where the light bulb turns on and you say to yourself, "Now why didn't I think of that before?" Actually, it was the globe in his hand that was doing the thinking, or should I say communicating. It was suggesting that the professor used the beam of green light it emitted to point to a place and time he wished to visit. Professor Watson was a little skeptical but very excited to try this. Would this be all that was needed to travel almost anywhere? Would this be all that was needed to travel almost anywhere? His assistants were due in about 30 minutes. He needed somewhere to go, but where? The learned professor decided he really wanted to visit the ancient Aborigines, the original inhabitants of Australia, who had traveled from Africa to take up residence some 46,000 years before Europeans landed in Botany Bay in 1778. He knew that to this day, they are nomadic hunter-gatherers with a rich mythology known as Dreamtime that is passed down from generation to generation. The professor wanted to visit the Aborigines when they first inhabited Australia to try to understand Dreamtime. This was a mystical time during which the Aborigines' ancestors established their world. It was a fascinating time when, for example, one of their many myths tells how the sun was made. He wondered if Alex and Nathalie would like to go on such an adventure with him. Before the professor could embark on such a journey, he knew he needed to test his theories in much shorter visits back in time. He sat in his car drinking another cup of coffee while waiting for his ground assistants to arrive. As he sat, he started reading the novel he had just started for the 4th time, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. He knew he wasn't very far from Gad's Hill, the early home of Charles Dickens. It was just a few miles along the ridgeway towards Rochester. Picking up the globe with both hands, he thought of Rochester Cathedral, Gad's Hill, and Charles Dickens. The globe immediately started to warm up. Suddenly, a deep green pencil beam of light appeared, and the professor pointed this light at the book. As the professor pointed the beam of light at the book cover depicting London and Paris, the color of the beam gradually changed to blue as it fell on a picture of Paris during the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, some 60 to 70 years before the book was first published. As the beam traveled over the picture of the famous Bastille prison, it started to change color to a deep red. Professor Watson was really surprised, as the globe had never done this before. Just then, his 2 ground assistants, Simon and Tony, drove into the car park in the Land Rover Defender. The professor placed the warm globe back in its pouch, then back into his pocket. Simon and Tony jumped out of the Land Rover. They were accustomed to preparing the hot air balloon for a flight, so they quickly carried the refilled propane tanks to the gondola, attaching them in place. Next, they carried out all the necessary balloon pre-flight checks. Satisfied, they started to blow air into the balloon with a large petrol-driven blower. Soon they could start the burners to fill the balloon with hot air. Once they started, it would be necessary for one of them to hold the line on the top of the balloon into the wind. This allows the balloon to fill with hot air, rising gently into a vertical position. As the balloon expands and rises, the gondola moves to an upright position. It is important to tether the gondola to the ground so that it doesn't fly away once this happens. Since the balloon is technically a flying machine, its registration and approximate flight path is registered with the local air traffic control. Most of the surrounding airspace is restricted. Below 1,000 feet is military with 1,000, 2,500 feet for light aircraft, hot air balloons, and helicopters. Above 2,000 feet is reserved for heavies or commercial aircraft. You know, the ones we all fly in to go on holiday. Hot air balloons are very tall, slow-moving, majestic-looking craft that are easily seen by those nearby on the ground. I need to lift off quickly so I don't attract too much attention, said the professor excitedly. Please like and subscribe.